We can now build a model of the economy using the tools we have gained. This is our Solow model, which shows three functions plotted on a graph. The production function represents the economic process of taking inputs like capital and labor and turning them into output, which we measure with real GDP. Our standard of living depends on what we produce, meaning that our income will be based on real GDP. Some of that income we will use for consumption, but some of it we will save. Whatever fraction we save is used to finance investment or the creation of new capital. So the green function labeled investment is defined by the fraction of income we save. And of course, some of our capital will depreciate at some rate, represented by the depreciation function. Where depreciation and investment cross is the steady state. At that point, the amount of capital added each year through investment is equal to the amount lost to depreciation. Follow that point down to the horizontal axis, and it tells you our steady state amount of capital. Follow it up to the production function, and then over to the vertical axis, and it tells you our steady state amount of real GDP. The Solow model is a very useful model of our economy. We can use it to see what would happen when we make changes to ideas, capital, education, depreciation, savings, and the rest. But just as we endogenized some aspects of economic growth like ideas and human capital into this model, we can go a step further and add our models of how the savings rate and the labor supply are determined by the economy. The graph at the top right is the market for loanable funds, or the credit market. This market sets the interest rates on loans, which is paid to the lenders and attracts savings into banks. In other words, this market sets our savings rate for the economy. The graph at the bottom right is the labor market. The demand for labor is determined by the productivity of workers, and the supply shows how many will be willing to work at every wage. This market sets wages, but also sets the size of the labor force, an important input to our production function. With these models together, we can think about what will happen when something in the economy changes. For example, when the Industrial Revolution increased labor productivity by pairing it with new machines, the demand for labor increased. When the demand for labor increases and shifts to the right, not only do wages increase, but the size of the labor force increases too. With more labor feeding into our production function, it shifts upwards and pulls investment along with it. We can see that our new steady state results in a higher level of real GDP, meaning this economy has experienced growth. That prediction matches reality, which is important if we want to use our model to make other predictions. For example, what happens when a financial panic rapidly reduces the supply of loanable funds? When the supply of loanable funds shifts to the left, it reduces the total quantity of funds available, meaning that we're now saving a lower percentage of our income, despite the sharp rise in interest rates. Normally, this would just reduce our investment, and we would see a small reduction in GDP. But after the Industrial Revolution, capital and investment were even more important. Pairing humans with capital is what makes us so productive. And so a reduction in capital would also mean a reduction in our labor productivity and a shift left of the labor demand. This would reduce the labor force feeding into our production function and shrink the economy even more. This model helps explain why recessions were so much worse after the Industrial Revolution, but it also shows us a way out of them. The newly formed Federal Reserve has the power and the tools to prevent the supply of loanable funds from collapsing during a financial panic. By regulating bank reserves, acting as the lender of last resort, and controlling the money supply through open market operations, the Fed could restore the supply of loanable funds immediately, making sure there was no break in our prosperity. The logic of the model is right, but the question is whether or not the model matches reality. This is our map, but does it fit the terrain? As with any model, that depends on the assumptions we're making when we build it. A century ago, macroeconomics wasn't really a subject of study. There was just economics, a discipline investigating how our economy makes decisions about scarce resources. And so the quote-unquote classical school, as we call it, wasn't really a cohesive school of thought on the matter. You wouldn't have been able to pick up a book on the subject and read about the predictions of the model we just looked at. Instead, there was an understanding cobbled together from the main tenets of economics. The three most important ideas which we have made use of to form our anachronistic model of the economy are Say's law of markets, self-correcting markets, and the quantity theory of money. Say's law of markets was put forward by the French economist Jean-Baptiste Say. He noted that when someone produces and sells a product in the open market, they earn an amount of money equal to the value of what they produced. And further, if we add everyone together, then their total income should be equal to the value of what they all produced in total. This means that total income for our economy should be enough to afford everything it is that we produce. It all feels like a bit of circular logic, and in some ways it is. But the takeaway is this. In a recession, people aren't earning enough money to afford everything the economy is producing. According to Say's law, that just cannot last very long. The lower incomes will bring down prices until we can afford everything that is produced. The reason we should expect those changes to happen is simply the market forces of supply and demand. When demand falls, prices fall, and markets make that adjustment happen automatically. Prices are a signal wrapped up in an incentive. When market conditions change, prices will adjust until the markets reach equilibrium again. And lastly, there is the quantity theory of money. This is a theory we will dive into more down the road, but for now, the key idea is that the price level, the average price of goods and services in the economy, should also adjust when there are changes in the money supply. So the ups and downs in the credit market should, in the end, only result in inflation or deflation. They should not result in persistent recessions. These three assumptions underpin our model of the economy. We are using Say's law to assume that the steady state in the Solow model sets real GDP, which in turn sets our income. We are also assuming that credit markets and labor markets and all other markets will adjust when there are fluctuations, setting prices to incentivize the efficient use of our resources, where nothing is going wasted or unused. And the quantity theory of money lets us conclude that our intervention via the Federal Reserve will help to manage prices and prevent financial panics, but it cannot itself be a source of economic growth or decline. With the Federal Reserve in place after 1913, working to keep prices and financial markets stable, all that was left to do was wait and see if it was going to work. After World War I came the first big test of the new system. When the war ended, there was a sharp downturn in the global economy as warring nations reverted to a peacetime economy, but also because the peace was uncertain for a while. Compared to the panic of 1907, however, this recession was a breeze. It was much shorter, just like the classical school predicted, and not nearly as severe. It seemed as though the new system was working exactly as everyone hoped, reducing the frequency of financial panics and recession. What followed was the Roaring '20s, a decade of unprecedented economic growth and change. The Dow Jones Industrial Average rose from $63.90 in 1921 to $381.17 in 1929. This is an annual growth rate of 25%. Mass production made technology affordable to the middle class, and assembly lines increased productivity. New infrastructure was built, including roads, phone lines, and plumbing. More and more of the U.S. was introduced to electricity. The city, as opposed to rural areas, gained prominence. Economic growth pushed above 5% for most of the decade, and America established itself as the richest country on earth. There was also a cultural renaissance, with women being given the vote, the spread of cinema, a new wave of music, art, and dance. It was a period of unbridled optimism and progress. Many believe this prosperity was now permanent. The problem of panics and recessions had been solved. John Maynard Keynes, who will feature heavily in the rest of this course, said in 1927 that we will not have any more crashes in our time. President Calvin Coolidge, in his State of the Union address, said of the U.S. economy, "In the domestic field there is tranquility and contentment, and the highest record of years of prosperity. In the foreign field there is peace, the goodwill which comes from mutual understanding." But there was one quote which proved to be disastrous for the man who uttered it. Irving Fisher was the most prominent economist in America, developing many of the theories of economics discussed in this video, including the entire framework for credit markets. His wisdom was also highly sought after by investors, and on October 17, 1929, reacting to what seemed like a briefly stalling economy, Fisher said stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. And no one would ever let him live the quote down, because less than 2 weeks later, a record-breaking crash in the stock market would mark the beginning of the greatest economic crisis the world has ever faced.